Welcome, everyone. Everybody find a seat. We'll get underway. My name's Scott Johnson. I'm the current president of the AIA chapter in Los Angeles, and we're happy to host a series we're calling What's Where, Academia and Practice. And for a long time, we have observed with interest the ever-changing relationship between the academic world and the world of practice, and we're interested in how that relationship works in various connections. The sort of territories defined, things that are in common and things that are perhaps not in common. And we want to explore that with the heads of each of the architecture schools in the Los Angeles area. I'm delighted to have Eric Owen with us today. He's the director of the Southern California Institute of Architecture. Happily at this traffic hour, downtown Los Angeles, although I don't know if Eric came from SciArc, but he might have. So Eric holds master's degrees in architecture from both Harvard and UC Berkeley. Eric Owen Architects was founded in 1973 in Los Angeles, and the firm designs and builds projects in the U.S. and around the world. Eric is a recipient of over 80 design awards from Progressive Architecture as well as the AIA. He has won the Academy Award in Architecture, as well as the Arnold Brunner Memorial Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And he's received the gold medal from the AIA LA chapter, as well as a Distinguished Alumni Award from UC Berkeley. His work is very widely published, with 10 monographs at last count, and he's the winner of numerous competitions from St. Petersburg to New York to the City of the Future competition sponsored by the History Channel. His work has been regularly featured at the Venice Biennale. Eric has taught at many universities around the world and first taught at SciArc in 1974, I believe.
Sounds close enough.
That's what they say. And was appointed the director of and was appointed the director of the school in 2002. That would be right, yes?
That's close.
Great. Okay. So what I'd like to do is we can encourage Eric to, I'm going to ask some questions from time to time, get Eric to talk in this area, in this realm, as he wishes to, and maybe we'll go for about 45 minutes, and maybe a few questions from all of you, should you have questions. Things are being video recorded for the purposes of being available immediately on the internet, as well as archiving these conversations. So, Eric, there's a lot to say, a lot to talk about. I have lots of questions. This is a topic of interest for me. I would just maybe kick it off by saying, personally, I've always admired how SciArc appeared to stake out a very particular position in the world of architectural academia. It's, at the one hand, has always seemed to be very exploratory, conceptual. In recent times, it seems to have taken on strong interest, compelling interest in the application of technology to these other themes. Can you talk about how you see, as a director, how you see the school in relation to school activities more generally?
You know, it's interesting to speculate on histories of institutions, and I suppose that SciArc has a reputation of sorts as a speculative or investigatory, or I don't know if the term radical is helpful at this point. I mean, the truth of the matter is that SciArc has many characters, and it has a number of histories. It's not one place, and I think it could be argued its strength is exactly that it's an institution which is moving and evolving, and if it isn't, and there have been times when it isn't or wasn't, then I think it gets into difficulty. So looking at an institution, that may be too vague and it needs to be more specific. But I think the idea or the underlying premise is that it oughtn't to be a school that promulgates allegiances. It's not a school for believers. It can't be symmetrical. It has to be symmetrical. To cite a relatively trite for instance. So I think the idea that whatever is out there, outside the school or comes through the school, and most of what is out there comes through the school with some regularity, for better or for worse, comes through and needs to be scrutinized, examined, debated, evaluated, and so on. And that's what the school's job is. The school's job isn't to inculcate a particular style or image or way of working or way of thinking. If the school does its job, it creates people who imagine the world of architecture in different ways. That doesn't mean it's easy to do that. It doesn't mean that lots of people do that. It also doesn't mean it applies only to students. I think SCI-Arc has always, and I think this is fairly consistent, that SCI-Arc has always felt a substantial responsibility for its faculty, particularly for like this guy, Mr. Wiscombe, and people who are coming along, who are starting to build, who are mischievous in a constructive sense of the word. And I think the school gives them a venue to speak, not necessarily to pontificate, to challenge what's available and to make alternatives available. And I think, again, this applies to faculty, applies to students. So if SCI-Arc does its job, it makes the people who make the pedagogy, and then SCI-Arc's job is to take that apart. So that would be an idealization of what the school ought to do.
You talk about speculation, the sort of speculative charge. You talk about being not one thing or a couple of things, but multifarious. It's many things. Do you feel your major obligation is too strong a word, your major role, in a sense, when you take on students and they spend several years with you and they go on, is your hope or your personal thought that they would be discharged as they depart from your school with that interest and strategy and mission to constantly take apart and reinvent? Is that where you leave them off?
I think that's an aspiration. Again, whether it happens, how often it happens might be part of the discussion. But I think as an ideal, I would say that's an objective. Now, the way the school works, both with the undergraduate program and the graduate program, students leave the school having produced a thesis. And if any of you have seen it, or better, haven't seen it, it's worth taking a look at. There's a thesis discussion and an exhibition in the spring, I guess, the end of April, if that's the spring. And then there's another for undergraduates. And then there's another one in the fall, which actually, I think typical of SCI-Arc, has remade the conception of graduation. So the graduation at SCI-Arc takes place in September as school opens. And it opens with a discussion of probably 3 days of the thesis projects, which are exhibited around the school. And then that's followed with a graduation. The graduation takes place in a pavilion which is built by the SCI-Arc faculty, one or two or a group, torn down every year, built again the next year, and so on. So there's a discussion of the work, which completes a group of students, opens for another group of students, leads into a discussion where various characters explain to the students who are now acclimated to that level of discourse what they should aspire to, and so on and so on. I think in that sense, there's something conventional about that. Although the people who I think this year we have John Louis Cohn, who did the Corbu thing in New York, and teaches at Princeton. And I'm going to pronounce her name wrong. She's the lady who runs the storefront, Eva Frank. Is it Frank? Yeah. So we have two. So we do that sometimes so nobody will entirely take the stage. So that's part of the discussion. That ends the year, starts the year, and so on and so on. I don't know that that's really an answer to the question, except to say, and maybe I should add this, that the thesis project In other words, if you're sitting there for 5 years or 3.5 years listening to various characters, you guys included, tell us how the world ought to be or where it ought to go. The thesis semester gives an opportunity for students, in a sense, to select out of that 3 years or whatever it is, discourse, and put together, at least for a few months, a point of view and say, I've listened to you, now you listen to me. And that's how the thesis works. And in successful cases, you can start to see an evolving perspective, which makes use of what's been said and exhibited and talked about, but ought to contain an aspect of idiosyncrasy that belongs to the student. And I think the students are encouraged to do that. So,
Are there, you talk about faculty or groups of faculty building a pavilion, taking it apart, then next year a new one comes in. You talk about visiting professors coming and then leaving and being replaced by others. Notwithstanding the relative consistency of a core faculty, do you do things like that? Do you do a series of things that become variables to constantly disperse the idea of polemical continuity?
I tend to, I mean, there are debates about this. I tend to look at the discourse and the production of architecture more in terms of personalities than in what it says in the catalog. In this year, we will learn the following. In this year, we will study the other.